All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So this is section 2 of session 3, creating a new kind of apologist for a post-Christian culture. So you're gonna notice these today, especially, are gonna cross over a lot into a lot of main ideas. Because I'll be honest with you, when I'm doing apologetics, I don't deploy just one way. I think all of these should be incorporated somewhere into your apologetics. So we're going to talk about now the mission to bring reason, conscience, and imagination to the world. So when we talk about cultural apologetics, what is it? There's this guy, Newbigin, who actually went to India and lived there for years and years and years on mission, and he is interested in realizing how can we take apologetics to the world. So Newbigin is interested in how we can talk to others about Jesus in a way that they can understand it by those who become maybe further removed from Christianity. And so when we talk about world religions, there's some of those like Hinduism, even when you get into Taoism and Confucianism, some that are so far removed from Christianity. And so this is what Newbigin understood, that every person in every culture is shaped by what sociologist Peter Berger calls the plausibility structure that we introduced in the last section, right? So how can we have a genuine missionary encounter on a daily basis in our culture today? How do we do that? So cultural apologetics must demonstrate not only the truth of Christianity, but also its, and I can't key on this enough, its desirability. I think one of the questions we asked in the last breakout is what is your attitude? I mean, how excited you are about what you're talking about, have to play, and if people are going to listen to you. Is it desirable? So we talked a lot in book 2 about our Athens, right? So how does our culture perceive the world? So in book 2, we worked on writing a biblical worldview. What does that look like? Everybody perceives the world in some way. In a word, we are disenchanted. So the opposite of being enchanted. So the view of the world presented in the Bible's sacred and beautiful writing, yet our culture treats it as mundane, ordinary, and familiar. So I said, well, I've heard that. Even somebody who's maybe been to church in their life, well, I know that story. I've heard it before. So how does our culture think? Well, in his book, Cultural Apologetics, Paul Gould, by the way, if you're looking for a book to read, I think it's a great book. It's not hard to read. It's not, I think there's some scholarly books that are a little more difficult. It's an easy read. It's called Cultural Apologetics. But Paul Gould states that the collective mind of our culture is essentially anti-intellectual and shallow, lacking the ability to think deeply about things that matter the most. Have you found this to be true? I have. And if you try to carry on a logical conversation with somebody, sometimes they can't even engage. So not only how do they think, but how does our culture live? So we are, for the most part, a hedonistic culture. You know what hedonism is? That's pleasure for myself. It's indulgent in me. So we move from one desire to the next. Oh, I want this new car, I want this new house, I want to go on this vacation or this cruise, or I want all of these things. So the disenchantment of our society, did I get off somewhere? Okay, I was making sure. Disenchantment of our society, so it is a mystery of how in the world created and sustained and loved by God, we fail to see it in its proper light. So it is a tale of two perceptions, two ways of seeing the world. So two problems we find in this perception. The first, it wrongly assumes that there is no evidence for God's existence, that is not obvious. So sometimes we assume that there is no evidence for God's existence is not obvious. The second one, it assumes that if the evidence for God were available, belief would automatically follow. So if we just give, that's what we talked about last time, if we just give enough evidence, their belief is going to follow, right? So God reveals himself because he wants us to flourish. The one in the garden that we said the lie that Satan brought was, well, he's trying to ruin your fun, sir, is not true. God wants you to flourish. I think this is a great thing that we need to infuse in our apologetics, and we will not begin to thrive until our love for him grows. So God does not force himself on anyone. I think this is key in apologetics. He desires a genuine love relationship with you. He doesn't force himself on you. In fact, Blaise Pascal observes, wishing to appear openly to those who seek him with all of their heart and hidden from those who shun him with all of their heart, he has qualified our knowledge of him by giving signs which can be seen by those who seek him. I think that's a key, and we're going to talk about that, by those who seek him, not by those who do not. If you've ever had a conversation with someone and you're giving them all of these evidences to look at and they just don't get it, it's probably because they're not seeking him. See, consider the religious leaders during the time of Jesus. They were eyewitnesses of the miracles. They were able to talk and measure his claims. They measured his character. They knew about the coming Messiah, yet what? They didn't believe. They missed it. Even though they had all of this evidence. So what we find out in Scripture and life is that two people can see the same object or event in two different ways. So I can see this world in one way, and you can see it in another way. In fact, what we see and understand depends somewhat on our perception of reality. You've always heard that the expression, hindsight is 20/20, right? Depending on how you look at it, how somebody looks like at something. So there's a different perception. So then we have the re-enchantment of society. This is what Jesus came to begin. Step one, suppressing the truth about God. That's what happened. We failed to give him thanks for what he's done. In fact, Romans 1:21, it says they were futile in their way of thinking. So as Paul unpacks the first chapter of his letter to the Romans, those who suppress the truth of God become futile and darkened in their way of thinking. So you see this little image up there. I should have put it in the slides, but on your page, it shows this cycle, right, that we go through. So we go through this whole cycle of re-enchantment. First, we suppress the truth about God. So when we fail to acknowledge God, it has a catastrophic effect on our perception of reality. So when we're not acknowledging God as God, it's going to change how we see things. So what comes into our minds when we consider God is the most important thing in the universe? Step two, emptying the world. Today, the world is emptied of the divine and the sacred. Today, the world is emptied of anything that most people in the world perceive as God. In fact, C.S. Lewis notes, at the outset of the universe appears packed with intelligence, life, positive qualities, every tree, right? So we read in Genesis account that he had provided everything for them to be satisfied. He gave them everything they needed. But man himself is akin to the gods. And so the advance of knowledge gradually emptied this rich and grand universe. First of its gods, then its colors, and its smells, and its sounds, and its tastes, and finally of solidity itself, as solidity was originally imagined. So we have rejected the knowledge of God and his plan for the universe. Step three, this is when their desires become awakened again. If you've ever been sharing your faith with someone and those desires begin to become awakened. So we must understand that once we have been re-enchanted from the world, we can never, ever, ever, ever go back. Once you've been re-enchanted from the world, you can't go back. In fact, it will be impossible. We can help others see Christianity as plausible and desirable. So if we embrace a faith that carries even whiffs of the transcendent, we're talking about the God that they can't see. We entice and invite others to see Jesus and the gospel as true and beautiful again. We want them to see this as beautiful. See, disenchantment is the loss of the transcendence of God. So when it says in Romans 1 that their minds were darkened, Remember that? So their minds were darkened. They were given over to their lusts and the desires of the flesh. So while the heart desires God, many are unaware of this deep longing that's inside of him. So what happens is the awareness of God comes in degrees. So we have repression, self-deception, and spiritual pride. So we repress the truth that we know to be true. We deceive ourselves. And then it leads to spiritual pride and a host of other things. So one of the best ways we can begin to reawaken that spiritual impulse in our life is through our imagination. What if? I love to do what ifs in apologetic. Well, what if? Let's say what if. Step number 3, returning to reality. The apologist's task of awakening is longing has been started at these starting points. Number 1, ask those we seek to reach for Jesus, what good do you long for? What is good? What's really good? Almost inevitably, the answer will be to be happy. I won't sing the song for you. You look at a lot of even pop culture and songs today are geared around people being happy. They want to be happy. As a culture, apologists, one way, somebody else can sing it, I hear you humming it. One way to awaken desire in others is to point out this universal longing for happiness while admitting that it remains elusive to most of the world. So what they're seeking, what they find happiness is, doesn't bring them happiness. We can point to the reality that this longing for happiness points to something we have lost. I love a lot of Jesus' parables and illustrations had to do with being lost. You have the lost coin. You have the prodigal son. You have all these lost parables. It's a longing for something that has been lost. See, the longing awakens us to the fact that our world isn't what we thought it was. Surprise, surprise. It's not what we thought it was. Suggests that there was a time when humanity was truly happy, which is now only a distant memory. So re-enchantment is the awakening of our desires. So Christians ought to, that's what we should do, see and delight the same way Jesus does. Do we see and delight in being a Christian? And this is why I say over and over again, Christians should be some of the most joyous, filled people in the world. Doesn't mean we don't have problems, but do we truly delight and see things as Jesus does? Number 2, invite others to see and delight with us. I love to just paint pictures, get other people to see and delight in the reality the same way we see them. Our call is to be curators of culture, hoping that Christianity will be seen as plausible and now desirable, something they want. So seeing reality as Jesus does. In fact, I love the beginning of Acts. The first sermon that was preached after the resurrection was by Peter, and he began to share who Jesus really was. And at the very end of it, this whole speech, and he laid it out. He said, "You're the ones who crucified your Messiah. You put to death the one who can bring you life." And at the end of it, it says they were cut to the heart and said, "What must we do to be saved?" See, that's a desire. Seeing reality as Jesus does. So the path of return to God lies through creation itself. Typically, that's where I start. If I start with apologetic, we start with creation. In fact, the gospel's good news was that heaven and God are here. He is here, lovingly sustaining, caring for. In fact, Willard explains it the following way. He says, Jesus, good news about the kingdom, can be an effective guide for our lives only if we share his view of the world we live in. To his eyes, this is a God-bathed and God-permeated world. It is a world filled with God. Everywhere you look is God. It is a world that is inconceivably beautiful and good because God has made it that way. And it always has been that way. Until our thought of God have formed every visible thing and every event in all of creation, so the word of Jesus has yet to be fully understood or even seized, he says. So cultural apologetics involves creating spiritual perception and recognizing creation. So inviting others to see reality as Jesus does. One of the best examples we have other than Jesus Christ in the New Testament is Paul. Paul never missed an opportunity to share the good news. I mean, good grief. Paul sang from prison. When he's being persecuted, he's in the stocks, and he's singing praises to God. He invites people to turn from their idolatry to a living God. And even when prison doors were busted open, you'd think he'd run for the hills. No, he stays. Paul doesn't point his listeners to human sinfulness and their need for forgiveness, although that is part of his gospel, and it's significant. He talks about sin a lot. But he wants to point them towards the beauty of God. In fact, he draws their attention to all the good and delightful things God gives to his creatures. He invites people to see and delight in God's good gifts that abandon the old, disenchanted way of seeing things. You know, you see, I think it's interesting throughout all of our old Disney, I'll go back to the old Disney movies, but if you go back to the old children's films, usually there's, in a lot of even fairy tales, you know, there's this dark enchantment that's fallen over the world and everything's dark. I mean, even look at Sleeping Beauty. I mean, that's a really dark tale, by the way, and so is Snow White. I mean, you talk about falling into a deep sleep you can never come back from, and there's these weird little dwarfs in the woods, and they come up and try to figure out what to do. So they put her in a glass sarcophagus, you know, and so you have the evil witch, and you have all this stuff going on that shows darkness. So I would say that is that's not delighting in God, but eventually somewhere there's light. So we also have false reenchantment. Sometimes people can seem to be re-enchanted, but they're really not. In fact, false re-enchantment, number one, is secular humanism. You've heard me maybe use that before. Well, let's talk about it. What is that? It's a particular belief system capable of moral reality and self-fulfillment apart from God. It means I can have fulfillment without God. I can be happy without God. In fact, humanism as a belief system relies on reason, logic, and naturalism instead of the belief in the supernatural. So humanism, with regard in particular to the belief that humanity is capable of morality, they're capable of self-fulfillment without knowing God. There's also a false reenchantment. I thought this one was interesting. He says the argument of virtual realities. We live in a virtual reality world. Sometimes it scares me to look at. But there's a virtual realities that offers similar promises of transcendent. Did you know that? There's a whole virtual world. Popular video games allow people to create whole lives, a whole second persona, or avatars to live alternative lives away from this universe. Think about that. I mean, so we've created all of these avenues for people to see what they perceive as goodness and happiness and satisfaction apart from God. In fact, Ray Kurzweil suggested that up until now, our morality was tied to the longevity of our hardware. Trust me, when our computer crashed this week, at the church, I'm like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? We don't have a computer. The hardware's gone. So as we cross the divide to insert ourselves into our, he says, computational technology, our identity will be based on our evolving mind file. We will be software, not hardware. As software, our morality will no longer depend on the survival of the computing circuitry. Our immorality will be a matter of being sufficiently careful to make frequent backups along the way. That's frightening. In fact, the promise of science is a new utopia. That's what they want. And this is not a political statement whatsoever, whether you believe in the Green New Deal or the things that are going on right now in our world, but all of those things are meant to bring a utopia apart from God. You're deceived if you think it is anything else. In fact, there's a false reenchantment number 3. Call this neo-paganism. It's another false reenchantment. It provides the trappings of transcendence while configuring human desires and aspirations and passions from the good, accurate, and beautiful towards the evil, false, and horrific. So here's the definition of neo-paganism. It's frequently linked with polytheistic views. It's believing in many gods, many ways, particularly pantheism, worship of all gods and human civilization. So pantheism is, I can see God in that rock, I can see him in that tree, so he's in everything. In fact, one neo-paganism practice is a benevolent work literally from magic or mystical powers, using supernatural energies within yourself to create your own reality. In neo-paganism, reality is not entirely flat, nor is humanity completely buffered or protected from the supernatural. Instead, humanity is vulnerable to unexplained powers, perhaps even gods and goddesses of the paranormal or the occult. You'd be surprised how many people, unbeknowingly, are messing with the occult. I mean, we see it in our shows. We see it in movies today. It's all around us. This is played out in a frenzy of books and television. Recent examples include Twilight Saga, Underworld, Grimm, American Horror Story, Stranger Things, The Magicians, and even, I like Doctor Strange. But when you look at it and really look what it's drawing on a power other than God. Establishing the Christian voice. So the place of reason in apologetics, that's where a lot of people, they just fade out. Philosophers, why do I need to know about them? What is reason? There's a spirit of anti-intellectualism in our culture today. So studies have demonstrated that we are literally losing our minds. In this book, The Shallows, Nicholas Carr says, whether online or not, my mind now expects to take in information the way the internet does and distributes it in a swiftly moving stream of particles. Once, I was a scuba diver in the Sea of Worlds. Now I zip along the surface like a guy on a jet ski. So what happens then is that we lose our ability to sustain what he says, linear thought. You know what that is? To see things as they really are. In fact, the calm, focused, undistracted mind is being pushed away. And it's being taken over. In fact, we dole out information in short, disjointed, often overlapping bursts, but we can't carry on. That's why I say can't carry on coherent conversation with someone on any logical level. In fact, Carr contends we have gone from cultivators of knowledge to being hunters and gatherers of electronic devices in our data forest. Many have felt the outside pressure today to view Christianity as unreasonable. You're going to hear this over and over. It's not logical, it's not reasonable. So people are looking for, I believe, a reason. In fact, logic, according to Isaac Watts, is the art of using reason well in our inquiries of truth. And then communicating it back to others. So that's what apologetics is you gain this knowledge from reading God's Word, you have the truth, so how do you communicate it back to others? In fact, Francis Bacon has said God has given us 2 books of sources to find truth. It's the book of God's work, i.e. creation, okay? So we have creation. It's the book of God's Word, which is Logos, or the Bible. In fact, in Romans 12:2, Paul commends us to use our minds. As good Christians, apologists living in an age of disenchantment, one must answer and press the question, does the Christian faith measure up to the standards of reason? Meaning, is the Christian faith reasonable? Now, you've heard me say this many times. Yes, it is. We are not a pie-in-the-sky faith, a wishful hoping or thinking. It is a reasonable certainty. In fact, the argument from reason to God. In fact, remember that naturalism is a view that there are no supernatural beings in the world. All that exists is the natural world. By the way, that's what most people believe in the world today. All that exists is what you can see. Even many other world religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism are all steeped and based in what you can see. We can formulate an argument from the existence of reason. Let me give you some of them. The existence of minds is not surprising under theism. The existence of minds is enormously surprising under naturalism. Because can I see your mind? Can you see my mind? I can't, And so we're trusting in something we can't really see. Therefore, the existence of mind strongly supports theism over naturalism, because I can't see my mind. In fact, the reality of mental, and we use a word, it's called causation. So that's in that apologetics. So what caused this to happen? Where did you get your idea of good and bad or evil? What caused, all of this to happen? In fact, J.P. Moreland notes that if the universe is causally closed, that means there are no more physical or material causes, then the sequence of mental events running through a person's conscience is like a series of causally impotent shadows. It means it's not real, doesn't happen. You're living in a virtual world. Starting points. I love these. So here's maybe a starting point for you. Consider the plausibility structure and sacred core of others, especially when making a case for Jesus and the gospel. And so we keep coming back to plausibility. So let's look at it logically. Where did all these things come from? How do we see reality? And having an awareness of the sacred core of individuals and their communities. So this is where we make the case for Christianity. Sometimes you must engage in false beliefs that hinder the gospel. This is hard for us. It was for me, to jump on somebody else's bandwagon side of faith and believe to lead them to the God of the Bible. So sometimes maybe an argument is one or more statements, and we call these premises, if you didn't know that. So these premises strung together to support another statement called the conclusion. So what you do in apologetics is you're going to make these premises to get them to a conclusion, all right? So remember that arguments are neither inductive or deductive. Remember we talked about the difference between inductive and deductive. A deductive argument says the conclusion must be inescapably true if the premises are true. So that's a Christian's way of thinking. But inductive arguments think that if the premises are true, the conclusion following premise, but not inescapably, may not be true. So I suggest that you practice formulating an argument or analyzing the arguments of others. So what I do, and what I've done in my apologetics, is before I ever even have talked to someone about my faith, I've already formalized these ideas in my own mind, right? As I study them and think about them. Or I'll talk to Aaron over here about it, or Joe. I'll say, hey, well, what do you think about this? This person said he's a pagan. I asked him what it meant, and this is what he said. How would you respond? And so we began to formalize our ideas. In fact, the place of conscience in cultural apologetics is huge. 1 Peter 2:12, Peter says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. So the church is seen by many as intolerant and judgmental. That's a lot of the blowback you'll get from the world. There are gaps between appearance and reality. So the gap between Jesus that we want and the Jesus we need, right? That gap between the church as perceived by the world and the church as it really should be one day will be the beautiful, alluring bride of Christ. So there's a long gap there. And so our job is to try to close that gap. There's a longing for goodness in everybody's conscience. Guarantee you. Remember what I said, if you ask somebody, what do you really want? What do you want in this world? People say to be happy. That's what I want. People want goodness. Human flourishing requires us to relate to our end purpose for living rightly. So there's a longing for wholeness in most people's life. Have you ever seen Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde? That one. I want to call this Dr. Jekyll effect. We know we want something. We know we want wholeness, right? And so when we're in our right state of thinking, those thoughts come to our mind. But then Dr. Jekyll takes over and pulls the lie over our eyes. There's a longing for justice in our conscience. I haven't found one person that doesn't want justice, right? When confronted with horrific evil and injustice, the human heart desires justice. Great idea of apologetics. So where did that thought come from? Where'd you get that idea of justice, right and wrong? There's a longing for significance in our conscience. Have you ever reached a point when you ask God, is this all there is? Is this the good work that you created me to do? I think we'd all be lying to ourselves if we said at some point we haven't reached there, but maybe at some point, and usually it's in our suffering or when we're struggling or things are not going well. Is this it, Lord? Is this all you have for me? See, there's an innate desire given to us by our Creator to live for something significantly greater than ourselves. Everybody wants to live for something more than yourself. And then trust me, when you get to be my age, you really start to sit back and say, so what have I accomplished in this life, Lord? I mean, is this all you have for me? So we now invite others to join us in the gospel story. So we pursue wholeness, we pursue justice, or pursue significance. So you could put those three things at the top of your apologetics. These are the things we're pursuing. And we're looking for morality. In fact, Lewis's argument for God, for morality, I know it's maybe not the easiest read. Mere Christianity, next to the Bible, is one of the top books I would say every believer needs to read in their lifetime. If you've never read it, I would highly encourage you to read it. It summarizes, I believe, what a Christian is and how we think. In fact, he says there's a universal law of right and wrong. I believe there's a universal law of right and wrong. People are born with it. Our children have it. My granddaughters have it. If there is a universal law, then he says there is a moral law-giving. Somebody has to set down the rules of that. There's a lawgiver. So there must be something beyond the material cosmos if there is a moral lawgiver, right? Somewhere outside of this realm that was created. So therefore, there's something beyond the cosmos. I mean, you see, we go around this circle with people, and so then we come to how do we move from the admission that there is a transcendent reality. I do find more people today, as I talk to them, will admit there's something more. They just don't know what it is, right? They'll entertain the idea. So why should we believe that the mind behind moral argument is personal, let alone the personal God of Christianity? Well, according to C.S. Lewis, a personal God is the best explanation for our present predicament. A personal God is the best reason for why we're in the situation we're in. In fact, it says, it is after you realize that there is a real moral law and a power behind that law, and that you have broken that law and put yourself in the wrong against God. It is after this, and not a moment sooner, that the Christian begins to talk. And you become a follower of Christ. I don't believe anyone can really come to faith without that. I think somewhere you have to know that you are a sinner, you've broken the moral law of God, there is a right and wrong, and there's only one way that you can be saved. And so what I want you to do now is you're going to talk about how do you apply cultural apologetics into your everyday life.